Burnout. Is it an individual's responsibility or are our organisations to blame? Question that often comes up. So here's my response. It's a little bit of both, but let me explain why. So yes, our organisations play a part. Of course they do. The World Health Organization defines burnout as a work-related term. And if we're working in a toxic culture, if we're working in an organisation that doesn't prioritise our well-being, of course we're going to be more at risk to burnout. However, I know many organisations that are shining examples in this space. I know many leaders who are shining examples in this space. And yet, they still have staff who burn themselves out. And they'll say things to me like, they're doing all this stuff I've not asked them to. And I keep telling them to take their breaks. I keep telling them they need to take leave. So personal responsibility is just as much a part of this. And there's no better example that when that was at play than during our COVID lockdown. So there were many people reporting that they were working longer hours because the lines between work and home had blurred. And in most cases, nobody had asked them to. It was the simple fact that I got up in the morning, I didn't have to commute, so I went to my desk, I sat at my laptop, I started work. I didn't have to finish and go and pick up the kids from school. I wasn't going anywhere that evening. So all of a sudden I look at my clock and it's 6 p.m. and I haven't logged off yet. That's our personal responsibility. So we have to take personal responsibility for how we show up, for how we set our priorities, and for what we say yes and no to. Obviously that's made a lot easier if we're working in an organisation that shares those values. But organisations are just collections of individuals, right? So if we all take individual responsibility by virtue of being role models in this space, we will form an organisational culture that is less likely to encounter so much burnout. Yes, organisations have a responsibility for employee well-being, but as employees and individuals ourselves, we control how we show up. We control, in many cases, particularly with our increased flexibility and autonomy, how we work, the boundaries that we set. So I talk about the 3 Ps in my Burnout to Brilliance workshops, and one of those Ps is the word priority. Only ever supposed to be a singular. So when it had first appeared in our language in the 1400s, priority, it was known as right through until the Industrial Revolution. So only in the 1900s we see it become priorities. And so now when we have 20 priorities, it's no wonder we feel overwhelmed. We're only supposed to have one. What is your one priority, your one focus? And the second P, performance. Performance comes in waves, right? We have a peak of our performance and then it has to be followed by rest and recovery so we can hit the next peak, rest and recovery, the next peak, rest and recovery. If we're not doing these rest and recovery troughs between the peaks, then we don't have the energy to get to the peak. So performance should look like this, not like this, and then the ultimate drop when we hit burnout. And the final P is permission. Permission. So often we need to give ourselves permission to take a lunch break, to finish early, to take what we need, to say no, to delegate. So if you're waiting for permission, remember that it's yourself you give permission to put you first, to ensure you're a sustainable resource. It's this concept I talk about of slowing down to speed up. When we slow down, take time out, focus on quality instead of quantity, what we find is that when we return to all of the things that are on our to-do list, they don't take as long. We make less mistakes, we think clearer, our minds are sharper, so we can focus and concentrate better. Decisions are easier to make, problems are easier to solve. So what might have taken us 6 hours now only takes 4. But that only happens when we slow down in the first place and take that time out to refuel, to refresh, to rest and recover, to be able to hit those dizzy heights of peak performance that we know we're all capable of. When we focus on the quality of what we do rather than the quantity, there's less busyness, there's less output. We focus on effectiveness rather than productivity of what we're doing rather than how many hours we're putting in. And that, of course, moves us further away from this, there's always more to do, this busyness that we can get so easily sucked into. And it's an outdated model that comes from the Industrial Revolution, where we were all in factories and we were obsessed with the quantity of what we were able to produce because we were pushing product out of a factory. And of course, that's changed, but we haven't quite caught up yet. And the same way, the environment that we live in, the world has changed. Obviously, COVID has been a massive impact on that, a global pandemic, and all that we've been through over the last 2 years, the constant change and uncertainty, the short-staffed nature of constantly having waves of COVID and absences and isolation periods, as well as the change we see in our organisation as we pivot again, and then try and figure out what the future looks like. When I first started working in HR, I remember we used to write in the contracts that working hours were between 9 and 5 with an hour for lunch. And for some organisations, you'd finish at 2 on a Friday. And now when I left HR, which was still a decade ago, it had moved to writing your hours of work are a minimum of 40 per week. So we do prioritise this quantity over quality, and it contributes to our burnout. But the one thing we have the most control over is how we show up. The permission we give ourselves to set boundaries, to say no, to decide what we're not doing as well as what we are doing. The priority that we get to focus on, or the question we get to ask those of authority. Okay, you said this was my priority, now you're asking me to do this. Which is your priority? Which do you want me to do first? I cannot do both at once. And of course, our performance, allowing those rest and recovery periods. We cannot perform at our peak the whole time, we just fall off the end, and that's how burnout results. And if you are in a position of authority, if you have influence in your organisation, remember that it is not your opinion that people follow, it is your example. And you have an opportunity from an individual responsibility perspective to role model in this space. Now, it doesn't matter what your policies say, and it doesn't matter how many times you tell your staff, you don't need to work late, I don't want to see you on your emails in your evening time. If you're doing it, doesn't matter what you say, the unwritten rule is that they are expected to as well. So be a role model in this space. Yes, I know there will be times where we work in the evening. I do it, and it's normally because I've been surfing in the afternoon or the sun's been out and I've been at the beach, so I'll log on at night and do a few emails. But it should be the exception, right? Not the rule. So we get to show up as role models in this space. Our organisations are collections of individuals, and if all of the individuals have personal responsibility around burnout, we create a culture that is less likely to burn out too.